Go. Good morning and welcome to the Community Services Infrastructure Grant Program. Next Steps for Grantees webinar by the California Health Facilities Financing Authority. CHFA is also what we call the California Health Facilities Financing Authority, so we'll be referring to our organization as CHFA throughout the webinar. This webinar is designed to help grantees understand the requirements on how to proceed and the steps to complete under the Community Services Infrastructure Grant Program, such as a disbursement request or submitting reports on grant activities. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this morning. For those who may not be able to join or stay with us for the allotted time, or for those who missed it, a recording of this webinar will be made available on CHFA's website. Before I move on, I would like to make mention that we will refer to this program throughout the webinar as the CSI program. On to slide number 2, I'm going to make some introductions. I am Carolyn Abubishar, the Deputy Executive Director of CHFA. With me today are Bianca Smith, Program Manager 2, Sandra Jacobs, Program Manager 1, and our grant officers, Corey Mohasib and Iman Hariri. We will have time near the end of the webinar to answer any questions you may have, but please feel free to enter questions in the live Q&A section of Teams at any time during the presentation. I'd like to address some housekeeping items for this webinar before we proceed. If you have any technical issues at any point throughout this webinar, message us in the chat section or the live Q&A section to see if we can help, but also remember that it will be recorded and you will have access to it after. Also, you can access the regulations on our website at treasurer.ca.gov/CHFFA. We highly encourage you to have the regulations on hand because they are the sources of the content we are about to present. Moving on to slide number 3 is the overview of the webinar. We're going to cover today the following items: the grant agreement, eligible project costs, readiness, feasibility, and sustainability, requirements for leased property, requests for disbursement, actual expenditures report, status reports, certification of completion and final report, and annual reports. Also, we'll be providing some helpful tips and resources at the end. On slide number 4 is information regarding the grant agreement. The grant agreements for the grants that were awarded during the first funding round of the CSI program have all been executed. For the grants awarded during the second funding round of the CSI program, we did not follow our normal procedures in the execution of the grant agreements. Due to COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders, the grant agreements were emailed to each grantee, not mailed. If you have not already done so, you will need to obtain 2 certified copies of a County Board of Supervisor resolution that accepts the grants and delegates an authorized officer or their designee to act on the county's behalf to carry out all grant transactions. Then you need to print and sign 2 copies of the grant agreement signature page that CHFA emailed to the grantees, and then mail the 2 certified Board of Supervisor resolutions and the 2 original signed signature pages of the grant agreement to your grant officer at CHFA. Once received, CHFA will countersign the 2 signature pages of the grant agreement and mail a fully executed grant agreement back to the grantee for their records. Please reach out to your grant officer with any questions about the grant agreement execution process. Now I will turn it over to Sandra to continue with the slides, starting on slide number 5 with eligible project costs.
Thank you, Carolyn. So beginning on slide number 5, we're going to go over the eligible costs together. First, let me point out that the costs must be incurred during the grant period and that all grant funds must be used only for costs directly related to and essential for the completion of the approved project. The grant period means the time period from the date of allocation, meaning the date that your grant was awarded by the CHAPA board, to the date set by the CHAPA resolution for the grant to end and the program to be operational. For most of you, that date is actually June 30th, 2022. For the CSI program, the eligible costs include facility acquisition. This also includes the acquisition of modular facilities. Renovation costs, meaning pre-renovation costs. So pre-renovation costs are eligible and include but are not limited to permit fees, surveying and architectural and/or engineering fees. Additionally, renovation costs also cover hardscaping and landscaping if essential for the completion of the project. So for hardscaping and landscaping, those items include things like walkways, grass, trees, plants. Also, the hardscaping and landscaping costs cannot exceed 5% of your total grant award. So if your project includes those items, it is important that you work with your grant officer to ensure that you do not exceed the 5% limit. So a lot of times, hardscaping and landscaping will also be wrapped up into your construction contracts or your renovation contracts of the facility. So if that's the case, make sure that when you submit your line items for facility acquisition or renovation, that it details how much money you're spending on the hardscaping and landscaping to make sure you don't go over that 5% limit. Also, eligible costs include furnishings and equipment, and that will include, but not limited to items such as chairs, desks, beds, dressers, sofas, refrigerators, washers and dryers, dishwashers, etc. IT hardware and software is also included as an eligible cost. So that will cover things like computers and your laptops, servers, the initial cost of software or required software used during assessment and/or telemed. However, we do not cover the ongoing expense of software licensing. Like hardscaping and landscaping, IT costs cannot exceed 3% of your total grant amount. However, if you need additional IT funding beyond the 3%, it is necessary to submit justification to your grant officer for consideration, and that justification will have to be approved by our executive director. Also included is 3 months of startup or expansion costs. So startup and expansion costs include and only include the training and personnel salaries and benefits, the training for your personnel salaries, and the benefits for those employees. We no longer cover additional things like office supplies and stuff like that. So make sure when you submit for 3 months of startup, that you only stick with those 3 categories. Also, please note that the county must maintain ownership of all items purchased with grant funds for the useful life of the assets. We will be referring to the useful life a lot throughout the webinar. It is basically an asset expected life. It will be determined by each county by consulting with its county council. Typically, it's 5 years for equipment and furnishings and approximately 20 years for real estate. Please reach out to your grant officer if you have any questions about eligible costs, and they will be happy to help you. So moving on to slide 6, we're now going to cover the readiness, feasibility, and sustainability requirements. Before CHAPA funds can be dispersed, we need to make sure that your project has received all the necessary approvals, that the completion of the project and its operating for services is achievable within the grant period, and that there is sufficient funding to complete and operate the project for the useful life of the project. The CSI program requires that all projects meet the readiness, feasibility, and sustainability requirements within 1 year of receiving the CHAPA board approval for your grant. For the first funding round, the deadline was July 25th, 2020, and for the second funding round, it will be March 26, 2021. CHAPA may approve extensions on a case-by-case basis, and approval is at the discretion of the executive director. If you need an extension, please reach out to your grant officer at least 1 month prior to the deadline. Please note that failure to demonstrate readiness, feasibility, and sustainability can result in the cancellation of your grant. So it is important that you work with your grant officer throughout the process. We are now on slide number 7. So some of you may have already submitted some of your readiness, feasibility, and sustainability documentation with your grant application. So please work with your grant officer to determine which items are outstanding and if any are needed to be updated. Not all projects will have a need for every item listed. If a requested document does not apply to your project, please provide a written statement to your grant officer so they can take note of it in your file. You will find a list of items needed for the detailed plan and timeline that need to be provided and established to establish readiness, feasibility, and sustainability, which include the rendering, floor plans, and the address where the facility will be located, necessary approvals to complete the project, for example, a Board of Supervisor approval, request for proposals, etc., architectural and/or renovation contracts, evidence of CEQA and prevailing wage compliance, building and/or conditional use permits, and if applicable, MOUs for counties applying jointly. A project timeline such as the project start date, when the renovation or acquisition will take place, and the project end date, which is when the renovation or acquisition is completed. And the project timeline should also include key project milestones as well as the date the program is expected to be open and begin providing services. Your staffing plan. Will services be provided by the county or a contracted service provider? How many staff members are needed to operate the new or expanded program? When will the hiring process begin? These are the types of questions you will need to answer when completing your staffing plan. Potential challenges and how the challenges will be mitigated. So examples, challenges that you may want to point out could include a reduction in leverage funding, a delay in obtaining appropriate certification or licensures, or natural disasters like the wildfires we've been experiencing, or a pandemic. That's a new one for us now. Okay, so moving on to slide number 8. And we will continue with the documentation needed to meet the readiness, feasibility, and sustainability requirements. So you will also need to provide proof of community outreach. So this may include a copy of a public meeting notice, the agenda, or proof of discussions in collaboration with other agencies. You will also need to provide information regarding your service provider selection or the process that will take place to select one. So if a service provider has already been selected, you will need to send a copy of the executed service agreement contract to your grant officer. If you have not selected one yet, you will need to provide a timeline of the selection process that should include the RFP process, the expected date the provider will be selected, final execution of the agreement contract, and the start date of services. Additionally, once a service provider agreement is executed, you will need to send a copy to your grant officer. You will also need to provide an explanation of the license and certification process. Please, for that, you need to include the type of licensure or certification that is required for your proposed program, and let us know the steps you will need to take to obtain the license or certification along with the timeline. You will also need to show approval of project and operational budgets. The budget should include any leverage funding, any evidence that the county is committed to operating the program for the useful life of the project, and a description of how it will be funded. Moving on to slide number 9. So now we're going to talk about leased property and the requirements. So the following, the items listed on the slide are required to release the funds for a renovation project on leased property. So the lease needs to reflect that the property will be used for the proposed program throughout the useful life of the project, and basically providing the grantee full access to the site to carry out the project. Your term of the lease needs to be at least as long as the useful life of the project. If the term does not cover the entire useful life, there needs to be options to renew for the term of the useful life of the project, and the county should provide a letter explaining what steps it will take to ensure that the lease will be renewed to ensure that services are provided on that site. The lease should also include any existing or subsequent encumbrance on the property, for example, a deed of trust, or sale of the property shall be subject to the lease agreement. The lease needs to have language similar to that in section 7426A4 of our program regulations regarding the remedy of default, including failure of payment. So that basically reads, the landlord's remedy for any default by grantee may not include cancellation of lease agreement, retaking of property, or eviction of the grantee. So the only remedy for any default is suit for rent or specific performance to remedy the specific breach. You will also need to include a current title report brought up to date as the effective date of the lease agreement. The title report should have no delinquent taxes or assessment. If there are delinquent taxes or assessments, proof that they are being contested. There needs to be proof that they are being contested in good faith. The title should have no easements, exceptions, or restrictions on the use of the site that will interfere with the operation of your project. It should also include a title report subject to a restrictive covenant recorded in the chain of the title stating that the property will only be used for the appropriate jail diversion services outlined in the grant application and for the useful life of the project. And it should also include a fee title that is subject to the lease agreement and recorded in the chain of the title. Moving on. You will also need to have a letter from your legal counsel certifying that the lease agreement conforms with section 7426 of our program regulations, including a statement of the projected useful life of the project. If your letter is signed by your authorized officer, there should be a statement in there that indicates that the grantee's legal counsel had also been consulted. The lease needs to have language similar to that in section 7426B to adjust the early termination of the lease prior to the end of the useful life of the project, stating that the lease needs to be renewed, or that the property, or that if the property is subject to the lease agreement, that the fee title to the property will be transferred to the grantee. Keep in mind that if the lease is not renewed, or the fee title is not transferred, CHAFA is entitled to recover the grant funds. Proportionate costs. When the project includes improvements to any common areas that are shared with other tenants and include as part of the grant funded project, the grant fund shall be limited to only the proportionate costs. So that means that if, for example, some renovation costs include work to be completed in the lobby of a building that is shared by more than one tenant. The total cost of the lobby's renovation is $1,000. The square footage of the other tenant's dedicated space is 750 square feet of the building, and the grantee will have the other 250 square feet of the dedicated space. The proportionate share of the lobby can be paid by grant funds will be 25% of the total cost, which will be equal to $250. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Corey Muhaseb, who will go over disbursement requests.
Thank you, Sandra. Hello, everyone. My name is Corey, and we're going to be starting on slide number 11, which takes us to the process for requesting for disbursement of grant funds. So prior to submitting a request for the disbursement, the grant agreement must be executed, and CHAFA needs to determine that the project is ready, feasible, and sustainable, as we discussed in the other slides. For the first disbursement request, you will need to complete the request for disbursement form and submit the required supporting documentation, which we will cover in the upcoming slides. For the second disbursement and any subsequent disbursements, you will need to complete the request for disbursement form, submit the required documentation, and also have completed the actual expenditures report for the previous disbursement with required supporting documentation as well. And we'll review that in the next coming slides. So moving on to slide number 12 is the continuation for required supporting documentation. So for renovation costs, you will need to submit building plans, costs and timelines, an executed construction renovation contract that may have not been provided to CHAFA, any applicable purchase orders, which includes the executed contracts, the executed contracts only need to be submitted once and not with each disbursement request. Purchase orders or invoices for renovation costs should include a line item of everything completed for that billing period. The architect contract and design and engineering contracts, if applicable. Also, building and conditional use permits, if applicable. Evidence of compliance with CEQA and prevailing wages also must be included. Proof of property ownership or an executed lease that meets the requirements as we just spoke about earlier. Please note it's easier to send invoices along with the requests for funds, so that way we don't spend a lot of time later reconciling with the county to make sure we have everything in accordance. Moving on to slide number 13. Let me repeat before we move back. So the recent appraisal within 6 months. So that has to be done with no longer than 6 months, and it has to be certified by a state appraiser. And if there's any zoning approval to obtain that, or plan to obtain those zoning approvals. And now moving on to slide 13. When requesting a disbursement for acquisition of furnishings and/or equipment, you will need to provide a list of items to be purchased along with the purchase orders. So for 3 months of startup cost, that includes training, personnel salaries, and personnel benefits. So with that, you would need to submit staffing plans, which should include a detailed job description, duty statements, and any documentation of salary or hourly rates, including benefits. For payroll projections or payroll expenditure report, we will include with certification language, which we will provide to you and also will be coming up on the next coming slides. For staffing, please provide the purchase order or invoice. Please note that travel expenses are not eligible expense. That extends to trainees who are charged for travel and per diem. Just for your information, we are allowed to give advances on requestments for disbursement. However, it may become as a challenge for both the county and CHAFA staff to reconcile in the future. So most counties in similar past programs have been making expenditures and then seeking reimbursement with the invoices as supporting documentation. We will now move to slide number 14, which is our requestment disbursement form. This sheet will cover the information that will be that the county will be providing regarding the amount of funding you're requesting and how it is broken down into the project categories. The project categories include facility acquisition, renovation, furnishings and/or equipment, information technology, and program startup. So this form will be signed by the authorized signer or designee of the county when listed in the grant agreement and listed in the Board of County Supervisors resolution. Don't forget to indicate if the scope of project has changed from the description of your grant agreement. If the scope has changed, make sure you talk to your grant officer to check to see how to approach approving the change and fill out attachment 1, which we will review on the next coming slides. So if we turn to slide number 15, which is attachment 1, the request for disbursement form, the request change form as well. This will be used to move funding between categories. You will fill out the approved amounts, which will increase or decrease for each category, and then what the final approved amounts would be, as well as explain the reasons for changing below. When completed, the totals of funding between the categories should equal the total grant amount originally approved. Completing the request for change will not decrease or increase your award amount. The third box on the attachment is lists where you would explain the scope of change, if any. If we move to slide 16, this is attachment 2. It's an Excel format document that your grant officer will provide to you electronically. You will submit this form, you will fill this form out, you will fill this form to fill out the details of your request by category and each contract or purchase order. When completing this form, it will be helpful to batch the line items by project categories. For example, if you have 5 invoices, of which 3 are for renovation, 1 is for IT, and the 3rd is for startup, you would list all the renovation invoices first before moving on to the next category. When compiling supporting documentation, examples, purchase orders, it is preferred that they are in the same order as listed in the Excel document for ease of our review. Please note that at the time of disbursement request, all that is needed for an advance is the bold yellow box, which is on the left-hand side of the form. However, for ease of reconciliation, it is best to include the invoices at the time of disbursement. Proof of payment can be sent and filled out later. If we move on to slide 17, I will turn it over to Iman, and thank you.
Thank you, Corey. My name is Iman Hariri, and I'll be talking about actual expenditures report and status reports. On slide 17, we will go over the actual expenditure report. In your request for the disbursement form, you are required to submit documentation to support the purchase of an item or service. But in the actual expenditures report, you are required to provide documentation showing payment was made for the purchase or the incurred cost. Actual expenditure reports are due within 60 days of project completion and upon SHAPA's request, prior to a subsequent disbursement, or if the entire grant was advanced, then the actual expenditures report will be due at the same time as the status report, which is due 45 days following completion of periods ending June 30th and December 31st. You do not need to submit the same actual expenditures report multiple times. It is only needed to be submitted once for approval. For each incurred expenditure, you will need to submit evidence of payments, such as purchase and sale agreements, proof of title, invoices, as well as canceled checks, proof of wire transfers, and receipts. When submitting canceled checks or proof of wire transfers that are not equal to the invoiced amount, you will need to submit a check stub or something similar showing the breakdown of invoices paid. For example, if you have an invoice for $20 was part of a $50 payment to the vendor, you will need to submit the check stub showing breakdown of the multiple invoices included in the $50 payment. For salaries and benefits, please submit payroll schedule with signed certification on county letterhead. Now moving on to slide 18. The slide 18 and 19 are snapshots of the actual expenditures report form. The first page on the slide is similar to the request for disbursement form and is the cover sheet where you will list out by category the actual expenditures, the actual cost expended or incurred. This form will need to be signed by the authorized officer or designee as indicated in the Board of Supervisors resolution. You will also need to attach an updated version of the same spreadsheet for the request for disbursement form as well as the supporting documentations we just talked about to support each line item, which will be on the next slide. On slide 19, it's the same Excel spreadsheet that I just mentioned that you used for the request for disbursements. You will need to fill out the rest of the form with the information detailing the actual expenditures, indicating the invoice numbers and amounts, date, and checks or wire numbers and amounts. Please notice that we will need the amounts of the invoices and amounts of the checks or wires because they could differ. I also would like to draw your attention that when you submit the supporting documentations, if they are organized and submitted in the same order as it is listed in the Excel spreadsheet, this will help us during the review and speed the approval process. Now moving on to slide 20. We are now going to be talking about status reports. Status reports are due every 6 months within 45 days following the completion of periods ending June 30th and December 31st of each year. So for the reporting period of January 1st through June 30th, the reports are due on or before August 15th. For the reporting period of July 1st through December 31st, the reports are due on or before February 15th. Status reports are your opportunity to let us know how the project is progressing and to bring to our attention any challenges. You will be submitting documents that will include the following: activities performed and population served, including involvement with law enforcement, social services, providers, and hospitals, summary of incurred costs and expenditures consistent with costs identified in the application, and an explanation of any variances, summary of data or preliminary results regarding outcomes, and a description of any challenges in obtaining data, a summary of other funding sources, description of remaining work to be completed, and an estimated timeline or schedule for completion of that work. Description of whether the project is within proposed budget, and if not, reasons and any differences and the actions to be taken to ensure that there is sufficient funding. Please do not skip a question. If no activity has taken place, or if you are unable to provide the requested information by the time reports are due, please include a statement stating that the reason why the information cannot be provided at that time. If you have more than one grant, please submit separate reports, even if the projects are similar or in the same facility. Your grant officer will send a reminder email prior to the date of the status reports are due. Now, on slide 21, slide 21 goes over the certificate of completion and final report, which is due within 60 days after project completion. This report will be sent to you by your grant officer. With the report, you will need to submit the following documentation if it has not already been submitted: program license and/or certification as applicable, summary of sources and uses of funds. If SHAFA funds were placed in an interest-bearing account, you will need to submit documentation regarding the account and the amount of interest earned. If interest funds were used to complete the project, you will need to include it in the actual expenditures report showing how the funds were spent. If there is any outstanding interest earnings that were not expended during the grant period, the monies will need to be returned to SHAFA. Project outcomes, keys, milestones, and accomplishments. For facility acquisitions, the final closing statement with certification by the title company. For innovation project, certificate of occupancy. The great news is that after submission of the certificate of completion and final report, the county will no longer need to submit the status report. Moving on to slide 22. After submitting the certificate of completion and final report, you are now required to submit annual reports. Annual reports are due by September 30th of each year for 5 years. However, JAFA may request additional annual reports after 5 years to ensure program operations and sustainability. The annual report needs to be certified and authorized by the authorized officer and summarizes the following: annual program capacity implemented and currently in operation, the types of treatments and or services provided, the key outcomes accomplished such as reduction in the number of individuals receiving treatment and or services in the jails and prisons, and the reduction in the need of treatment and or services in jails or prisons. The number and demographics of clients who completed the treatment and or services, along with the number and demographics of those who did not complete the treatment and or services and returned to the jail or prison. The value of the program. Is there a cost saving of the program compared to the cost providing treatment and services in the jail and or prison? And now I would like to turn it over to Bianca to give you additional information and helpful tips.
Thank you, Iman. My name is Bianca Smith. I'm the program manager with JAFA. And thank you everybody for participating in our webinar. At this time, I would like to go over some helpful tips that are listed on slide number 23. So, first one, you should refer to the program regulations and the JAFA website for program information and updates. You can find the program regulations on the website, or if you need, you can ask your grant officer to email you a copy. As Carolyn mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the regulations are super important and they will help you. They contain all the information you need to navigate through the process. Secondly, you should stay in contact with your grant officer. We are here to assist you with any questions or concern you may have pertaining to your grant and the grant requirements. Third, if the project has a proportionate share, we encourage you to work with your grant officer to determine upfront how the percentages will be applied. Taking this extra step at the beginning will save time when we review the disbursement requests and the actual expenditure report. Fourth, collect the disbursement and actual expenditure documentation as you go. Waiting to pull it all together after the fact can lead to missing documentation that could result in an expense being deemed ineligible. You always need to have the documentation to prove that the funds were spent accordingly. So if you don't have that one, an item can be deemed ineligible. Fifth, utilize the spreadsheets supplied by JAFA to track expenditures as they incur. Again, do not wait to compile it all right before submission. This way you will save time and your submission will be accurate and contain all the documentation. Sixth, keep the project and final records for at least 3 years after the grant completion. This is a requirement of the program regulations under section 7429, and that way, if the program is audited, you are good to go. 7, ensure that the project is being used as intended by the grant and is providing services for the target population for the useful life of the project. If not, CHAFA could request remedies, including forfeiture and return of the grant funds. Moving on to slide 24. Here you can see, on this slide, you can see CHAFA's website address, which is www.treasurer.ca.gov/CHAFA. And on the main page, you will find links to the various CHAFA programs. We have, as you can see, we have a lot of other programs helping our communities. The CSI program link is pictured in the box with the scales of justice. You have a star, a yellow star there highlighting exactly where you can find the CSI program. We also would advise you to sign up for the listserv so you can stay up to date with any CSI program updates and other funding opportunities available through CHAFA. Moving on to slide 25. Here we have the web page for the CSI grant program. Here you will find information pertaining to the program in the center of the page. Then to your left, there are links to the statute, program regulations, reports and previous webinars, as well as frequently asked questions. You may want to bookmark this page so you can have quick access to the regulations and any program updates. And at the bottom, you can see the listserv link where it says connect with us. There's a box, a blue box that says listserv. That's where you can click and sign up for any information on the CSI program or any other programs that CHAFA has, and as well as any other programs within the State Treasurer's Office. All right, moving on to slide 26. Questions and answers. At this time, we would like to give you the opportunity to ask any additional questions you may have. Please click the live question and answer icon on the Teams banner to submit your questions. And then give us a few moments as we go through your questions. We will review and return shortly.
Okay, well, this is Carolyn Abubishar. I think we got a question, so we'll try to answer that. But please, if anyone else has any question, go ahead and send it to us so we can answer it for everybody on the webinar. Okay, let me start with the first question. So someone is trying to confirm the dates that the reports are due, and we have a number of reports. So Sandra, if you could help us. So we could start with the status reports. The deadline for those, the County of San Joaquin's asking, are they 2/15 and 8/15 for the two status reports?
Yes. So yeah, so the 15th of February and the 15th of August fall about the time of the 45 days after after the reporting period. So yeah, so every year the status reports are going to be due around those times. Again, that's February 15th and August 15th. The other report that's going to be due after you guys have already been open and have submitted your completion reports to us, those at that time you'll be doing annual reports, and those will be due the September 30th of every year for 5 years. Again, with the added note that we can request it beyond the 5-year timeline if needed for sustainability of our program. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, and then she had a question about the completion report. So yes, it's like she said, 60 days after the project's actually completed. So
yeah,
correct.
So when you're, that is correct. Yeah, so when you're when you guys become open and operational, and you guys your grant officer will send you an email with a form that will need to be completed along with some narrative that you'll add to it. And that is due 60 days after your project's been completed. So after your construction, renovation, or whatever is done, and you guys have started providing services. So after you complete that report is when the annual reports will kick in.
So in summary, there's status reports that are due twice a year until your project's completed. Then you submit an annual report for about 5 years, if not more, if requested by CHAFA. And then there's also the completion report when your project is done. Now, there's also the annual expenditure report that's due with the status report if a county has received a disbursement. So keep that in mind. I think that's one point. So the disbursement requests can be on an advance basis or can be on a reimbursement basis, but either way, after a county gets a disbursement, they will need to prove that they paid for those costs. So there would be an actual expenditure report needed with each status report, if not already submitted. Hopefully that's clear. Let's see. And then the county asked if there's any other reporting requirements. I think we just summed them. Anything else, Sandra?
Those are the only ones I know of. Yeah, so I think we did sum it up. Sorry.
Okay, we have another question. Will this information or this presentation be available to refer back to in the future?
Yes, the recording of this presentation will be on our webpage probably within the next week. And then also, if you would like to request a copy of the actual PowerPoint, you can request that from your grant officer, and we will be happy to send that to you also.
Doesn't seem like we have any more questions. I think one thing just to take away is be in constant communication with your grant officer, and that way if you have any issues or they foresee any issues, we can take care of them as they occur. So we can make sure it's a smooth process for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess no more questions, and obviously we're all available here. So if you come up with any questions after this webinar, you can email us, you can call us. We're happy to help and answer any questions after the fact. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining this webinar, and hope you have a great day and stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.